In lesson 4.6, we will be doing an investigation. Our essential question that's going to guide our learning for this is, how can you use a model to multiply decimals? So today we're moving onward and we're just doing decimals by decimals. So, boys and girls, let's get going. We're starting at the top of the page, and everybody can read along with me as I read aloud with you. The distance from Charlene's house to her school is 8/10 of a mile. Charlene rides her bike 7/10 of the distance and walks the rest of the way. How far does Charlene ride her bike to school? You can use a decimal square model to multiply decimals. So what we're going to do, boys and girls, is we're going to multiply 7/10 by 7/10. First thing that we're going to do, which we can check off, is draw a 10 by 10 square. If you notice, there are 10 columns and 10 rows. So make sure you stop the video and pause and draw that right now. It says, what decimal value does each column represent? So this is going to be something new for us, boys and girls. Each decimal column represents 1/10. So if we count it out, 1/10, 2/10, 3/10, 4/10, 5/10, 6/10, 7/10, 8/10, 9/10, 10/10, or 1 whole. Next, using a color pencil, shade columns on the grids to represent the distance to Charlene's school. So the distance to her school, if we go back up to the original problem, it says is 8/10 of a mile. So what we're going to do, boys and girls, is we're going to shade 8 columns. So boys and girls, what we're going to do is the distance to the school is 8/10 of a mile. We're going to use a color pencil to shade 8/10. So we have 1/10, 2/10, 3/10, 4/10, 5/10, 6/10, 7/10, 8/10. How many columns did we shade? We shaded 8 columns. Next, boys and girls, it says divide the square into 10 equal rows. So we can check out. Do we have 10 rows? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10? Yes, that's correct. We have 10 equal rows. It says, what is the decimal value that each row represents? Again, boys and girls, the decimal value that each row represents would be 1/10, which is good because we see that both of our decimals represent a tenth. So our first decimal we colored in blue, which was 7/10, and what we're going to do is we're going to use purple for our next decimal, which is 8/10. So we're going to go on to D. It says, using a different color, shade the rows that overlap the shaded columns to represent the distance that Charlene rides her bike to school. So we're going to use purple and we're going to shade the rows. But notice, we're only going to shade the row up to where our last little column was. So we're going to shade 8 of these. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So boys and girls, if you look right now, and we go back to it, it says, what part of the distance does Charlene ride her bike to school? We know that she rides it 7/10. And notice, we colored in 7 rows. Now it says, how many rows do we shade in? We can write down again, 7 rows. Part E says, count the number of squares that we shaded twice. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into here, and we're going to see how many squares that we shaded twice. If we look at it, we did 8 columns and 7 rows. We know that 8 times 7 is 56. So we know that there are 56 squares, but we know that each square represents 1/10. So boys and girls, it says record the value of the squares of the product. We know that the product of that would be 56 hundredths. So Charlene rides her bikes for 56 hundredths of a mile. Next, we're going to go on to draw conclusions. It says, explain how dividing the decimal square into 10 equal columns and rows shows that tenths multiplied by tenths is equal to hundredths. So this is a very important key concept that everybody can listen to many times while they do this lesson at home and at school. The columns and rows represent tenths. So they both represent tenths. The small squares created by the overlapping rows and columns show hundredths, and they represent the product of a tenth multiplied by a tenth. So boys and girls, if you need to pause the video at this time to write that down and to think about that process, please do so now. Next, our hot question, comprehension. Why is part of the model representing a product less than each factor? So boys and girls, if both decimal factors are less than 1, and if we think back to our original problem, which we just did, 8 tenths is less than 1. 7 tenths is less than 1. That means that the product would also have to be less than 1. So the product will be less than 1, and the product will be less than both factors. And boys and girls, if you think to yourself, 7 tenths is like having 70 cents. 8 tenths is like having 80 cents. 8 tenths times 7 tenths will give you 56 hundredths. Is 56 cents, boys and girls, less than 70 cents and 80 cents? Yes, that would be correct. So boys and girls, we have one last section of this, which is make connections, which we're going to go through together. And like I said, as a grown-up who's gone to college and past college, this is hard for me to understand. So I hope that you take the time to go through this several times on your own. It will make your life easier for the rest of the week and for our chapter test, which we will take next week. Make connections. You can use decimal squares to multiply decimals that are greater than 1. So boys and girls, if we look here, we have 3 tenths times 1 and 4 tenths. So boys and girls, it says step 1, shade the columns to represent 1 and 4 tenths. How many tenths are in 1 and 4 tenths? So boys and girls, 1 and 4 tenths would be 14 tenths. And notice, remember, when we get to 10 tenths, that's when we traded for 1. So 10 tenths plus 4 tenths, boys and girls, would give us 14 tenths. So boys and girls, what we're going to do is we're going to shade 14 tenths first. So we're going to shade this whole column because there's 10 tenths inside of there, and then we're going to shade 4 more. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Next, boys and girls, it says step 2, shade the rows that overlap the shaded columns to represent 3 tenths. So boys and girls, we're going to go across and we're going to shade just along the columns to where the columns ended. So this would be 1 tenth, this would be 2 tenths, and this would be 3 tenths. How many rows did we shade? We shaded 3 rows, boys and girls. So now remember, our product, boys and girls, can be found by the overlapping rows and columns. So boys and girls, if we think about it, we can think about this as 2 multiplication problems together. Here it says, count the number of squares that you shaded twice and record the product. What I like to do is I see here, I have 4. How many squares do I have here? And how many squares do I have here? If you counted 42 squares, boys and girls, that is correct. But remember, boys and girls, each one of those squares represents a tenth, so it's actually 42 hundredths. So boys and girls, this is our lesson that is going to build upon our lesson tomorrow, lesson 4.7, where we're just going to use the step-by-step procedure for multiplying decimals by decimals.